Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa. Idris, with me, Sharaad, Kuttan, and our guests today, Dr. Ione Jolly as well as Vernon Adrian Emuang, talking about the Eurasian community. So, Dr. Ione, your thesis wrote about the post-World War II Eurasian exodus from Malaysia and Singapore to Australia. Now, I want to ask about the push factors and the pull factors. So what were some of the reasons, the rationale for leaving Malaysia and Singapore, and the reasons you mentioned just before the break? Australia could possibly be the cheapest, the closest and the cheapest place. So what did your research find?
Malaysia and Singapore after the war were quite unstable. And so that's not just in terms of security, it was in terms of jobs, employment, housing. There was a lot of change. My grandfather, for example, from the time he was 16 to the time he was 43, he was living basically in a state of conflict. So you had the emergency, you had confrontasi, you had people bombing trains, you had the war. So they were looking for somewhere that was more secure, that was safer, that they could sort of bank their children's future on. So they wanted the English language environment was incredibly important. So that was in workplaces and in the educational system. My grandfather he worked for a private Australian company in Malaysia called Humes, and towards the end of the 60s he'd actually been instructed to learn Jawi, and I think that was one of the breaking points for him. He'd had to learn Japanese during the war, and now he's having to learn Jawi, and it was being imposed and forced on him. He could speak Malay, that wasn't the issue. Most of my family could speak Malay. It was how extreme the language policy may get. Not how extreme it eventually got, but just how extreme it possibly could get. The Christian environment, it was very, very important to our community. And in Australia, you have the option of complete freedom of religious expression, and you have the option of not expressing any religious beliefs at all, which happened with a lot of our community, where a lot of us who stayed are a lot more Catholic and Christian than the ones who left. A lot of people were looking for a different lifestyle. So you have a lot more space and openness. So the environments that we had pre-war, where people had houses and gardens, and it was just a different way of living. We have that there.
Right, so we're talking about the 50s and 60s. And we have the Cold War, and the international context of that is quite extraordinary. I want to draw Vernon back into the conversation. When many Malaysians have family overseas. I mean, there is a Malaysian diaspora, yes, right? And Australia counts as home of many former Malaysians. How important are these stories, Vernon, about why people left and the circumstances? Do they still play out today in Malaysia-based Eurasian society?
Well, I think the stories are really important because it offers perspectives from different points of view. I mean, like a lot of the people who migrated from our community, why did they leave? I mean, people who were left behind or people who didn't go would like to, I think would be enriched if they knew what were the reasons that made them leave, number one. Number two, what kind of experiences they had. Number three, how did they feel about the homeland that they left? Those kinds of issues of belonging, identity are really important so that we can also, in a sense, trace how we feel about our own selves,
Okay, Ione, the question of homeland, it's an interesting expression. Do Eurasians think of themselves as having a homeland, considering the multiple trajectories in which constitutes the Eurasian community? You have Dutch ancestry, you have British, white, Anglo ancestry, you have a whole range of possible points of origin. Is there something like a homeland for the Eurasians?
Malaysia and Singapore, that's our homeland. It's where our community was formed, it's where people feel they belong. I'm speaking for my generation, my mother's generation, I'm not speaking for the pre-war generation. My mother left PJ 51 years ago, she immigrated in '68 to Australia, and she still refers to this as back home. She's like, oh, back home, blah, 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 which confuses people in Australia, because she's been there for 51 years and she left as a 10-year-old. So the homeland is here. They talk about a new Eurasian homeland in Perth because so many people migrated to Perth, but the reality is it's still Singapore and Malaysia.
So did your research find that life was better for Eurasians after migrating to some place like Australia? Because, you know, you talked about some of the push factors, language, policy, unstable political environment. So was life better? Was the grass greener on the other side?
I think it depends on the individual. So I've got family and friends here who have amazing lives. I mean, I could only aspire to their lifestyle. But then, as I say to people, if you have your health and you have a great job, Malaysia's brilliant.
I think there are various issues that affect how one is happy or not happy when a question is asked. And from my own observations of people in my community, you know, like for instance, I went to Australia to study. And when I did leave for Australia, I think there was a glimmer of hope in my parents' eyes that perhaps I might be the entry point for the family to settle in Australia. But I came back and I stayed. And a lot of people have asked me, do you regret? And I go, no, I came back because I felt I had a better chance with my Australian degree here in Malaysia, which proved to be correct. You know, so that sense of where is your homeland, I guess, is where you decide this is where your future either is, or where your past was really something else that you really cherish.
Right. I mean, the colonial world, and specifically the British colonial world, created communities that were hybrid. And so the experience of the straight settlements in this part of the world were replicated in Sri Lanka and Anglo-Indians in India and so on and so forth across, you know, the British Empire. Is there any sense of commonality? I mean, are there links between Eurasian communities from different contexts?
There's a lot of common experiences, but it's sort of like the Anglo-Indians in Malaysia, sorry, in Australia, are a separate community to the Eurasians, so they don't come together in that respect. But there's very much common experiences. The same reasons they left, the same reasons they came to Australia, exist for each community. So there is a commonality of that, and there was a lot of fear that pushed people.
Okay, in just a couple of minutes, we'll come back and continue this conversation. So make sure you stay right here on Consider This.